In 2008, a studio handed a first-time blockbuster director the keys to something nobody fully understood yet. Not a movie, a universe. And the man they chose wasn't a visual effects pioneer. He wasn't a franchise veteran. He wasn't someone who had spent his career building toward this moment with a grand plan in mind. He was a guy from Queens, New York who used to do improv comedy, who wrote a movie about his broke friends trying to make it in Hollywood, who got his first real break playing a lovable sidekick in someone else's film. Jon Favreau. The name doesn't hit like Spielberg. It doesn't carry the mythology of Kubrick or Nolan. Most casual moviegoers couldn't even tell you what he looks like, and yet, quietly, methodically, almost invisibly, this man changed cinema not once, but twice, maybe 3 times, depending on how you're counting. So today, I want to shine some light on Jon Favreau. Not just on what he made, but on how he thinks. Because the way this man approaches his craft is something genuinely rare in Hollywood. And once you understand it, you'll never watch one of his movies the same way again. Before we get to any of that, we need to go back to where it all started, because Jon Favreau did not grow up destined for Hollywood. He was born in Flushing, Queens in 1966. His father was an art teacher. His mother passed away from leukemia when he was just 8 years old. He studied at Queens College, majored in computer science, dropped out, moved to Chicago, and started doing improv comedy at a place called Improv Olympic. Now, improv comedy in Chicago is serious business. This is the same tradition that produced Bill Murray, John Belushi, Tina Fey, and dozens of others. The foundation of improv is simple. Listen, react, build. You don't come in with a fixed plan. You respond to what's in front of you. You follow the scene wherever it goes. That discipline turns out to be the most important thing Jon Favreau ever learned. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 90s, with almost no connections and almost no money. He worked as a waiter. He worked at a comedy club. He went to auditions. He got rejected. He went to more auditions. And slowly, things started moving. He landed a small role in Rudy in 1993. Then a few more, nothing that would make headlines, but enough to keep going. And then came Swingers. Swingers is one of those movies that costs almost nothing and somehow becomes everything. Made in 1996 for around $200,000, it tells the story of a group of young guys in Los Angeles trying to navigate careers, romance, and the unbearable experience of waiting for the phone to ring after a date. Favreau wrote it. Favreau starred in it. He based it directly on his own life. The result was a movie that felt so real, so specific, so genuinely funny and sad at the same time, that people who saw it felt like they were watching their own lives played back to them. It made around $5 million at the box office. Not a blockbuster by any stretch, but in Hollywood, certain movies don't succeed by making money. They succeed by making the right people pay attention. Swingers made people pay attention to Jon Favreau. What it told the industry was this: here is a filmmaker who understands human beings, who can write dialogue that sounds like how people actually talk, who can take a small, ordinary situation and make it feel like the most important thing in the world. That is, it turns out, exactly what you need to make a superhero movie work, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, Favreau kept building. He wrote and directed Made in 2001, a crime comedy he made again with his friend Vince Vaughn, picking up where Swingers left off in terms of voice and energy. Then came something unexpected: Elf. In 2003, Jon Favreau was hired to direct a Christmas comedy starring Will Ferrell as a human raised by elves at the North Pole. On paper, that sounds like exactly the kind of movie that gets made, earns decent money over the holiday season, and disappears from conversation by February. Instead, Elf became a classic. It is still one of the most watched Christmas movies ever made. It airs on television every year without fail. Entire generations have grown up with it. And here's the interesting thing about Elf that most people overlook entirely. Favreau shot it on a shoestring. He didn't have the budget for elaborate digital effects, so instead he leaned into old Hollywood techniques. Forced perspective, practical sets built at different scales, stop-motion animation for the Christmas elves in the background, techniques that were already 50 years old when he used them. Most directors in Hollywood in 2003 were racing toward digital. More CGI, more green screen, more post-production. The future was computers, and anyone clinging to old techniques was seen as behind the times. Favreau didn't agree. His argument, which he has made in various interviews over the years, was that audiences can feel the difference between something real and something digital, even when they can't explain why. The eye picks up on texture, weight, imperfection. A practical effect that is slightly imperfect reads as real. A digital effect that is technically perfect can still feel weightless, hollow, fake. He would spend the next 20 years proving that argument right. But first, he had to learn when to break his own rule. In 2007, Marvel Studios, then a relatively new operation that had just regained the rights to some of its own characters, came to Jon Favreau with a proposal: make Iron Man. At the time, this was not obviously a great opportunity. Iron Man was not Spider-Man. He was not Captain America. He was not one of the characters that general audiences immediately recognized. He was a B-tier superhero, a billionaire in a metal suit known mostly to comic book readers. Marvel had limited funds. They were essentially betting the entire future of the studio on this one film working, and they were hiring a director whose biggest credit was a Christmas comedy about a man who thought he was an elf. Favreau has said that he was terrified, not because he doubted himself as a filmmaker, but because Iron Man required exactly the thing he had spent his entire career avoiding: a lot of CGI. A man flying through the sky in a metal suit, an armored battle sequence, technology that simply did not exist in the physical world and therefore could not be built practically on a set. For a filmmaker who believed in the primacy of the real, the tactile, the tangible, this was a genuine creative crisis. So he did what the improv training taught him to do. He didn't pretend to have the answer. He went and found it. What Favreau did in the lead-up to Iron Man is remarkable, and almost nobody talks about it. He immersed himself in the technology. He sat with the VFX teams. He asked questions that most directors with established reputations would never have asked, because asking basic questions requires admitting you don't know, and admitting you don't know requires a level of humility that Hollywood doesn't always reward. He put on the motion capture suit himself. He ran tests. He looked at what the technology could and couldn't do, where it felt weightless and fake, and where, under the right conditions, it could actually fool you, and he came to a conclusion that changed how he worked forever. CGI, used correctly, is not the enemy of reality. It is just another tool. The problem was never the technology. The problem was filmmakers using it as a shortcut, leaning on digital effects to replace practical craft, instead of using them to extend it. Favreau decided he would use CGI only where it was genuinely necessary, where no practical solution existed, and would surround every digital element with as much physicality as possible. Real sets, real props, real light, real actors reacting to real things. The Iron Man suit was built practically as a full physical costume for every scene where Robert Downey Jr. was standing on the ground. Only when the suit flew did it become digital. The distinction is subtle on screen, but the eye feels it. Iron Man came out in May 2008 and made $585 million worldwide. More importantly, it worked. The character worked. The tone worked. The world felt believable, and audiences, who had seen plenty of superhero movies by that point, felt something they hadn't expected to feel in a film like this. They cared about the person inside the suit. That is entirely down to Favreau, not the effects, not the action sequences, the choice to center a superhero film on a specific, flawed, funny, recognizably human person. That instinct came straight from swingers, from improv, from years of learning that the most interesting thing on screen is always a genuine human being. The MCU, the most successful entertainment franchise in history, a machine that would go on to generate billions upon billions of dollars across dozens of films and television series, begins with a creative decision made by a guy from Queens who used to do improv comedy in Chicago. All jokes aside, that is an extraordinary thing. Now, most people would have stopped there. You build the thing that launches one of the biggest franchises in history, and you ride that wave, you stay in the superhero world, you become the reliable blockbuster director, you take the meetings, you accept the sequels, you protect your position. Jon Favreau made Iron Man 2 and then stepped back. Not away from Marvel entirely, he stayed close, producing and appearing in films across the franchise for years, but he handed the directorial reins over because something else was pulling at him. He wanted to understand where filmmaking was going, not where it had been, not where it currently was, where it was going. That curiosity led him somewhere unexpected. it led him to a kitchen. In 2014, Jon Favreau made a small film called Chef. No visual effects, no franchise, no studio pressure, no Marvel executives in the room. Just a man, a camera, and a food truck driving across America. The story was simple. A celebrated chef loses his restaurant job after a public meltdown, buys a beaten-up food truck, and drives from Miami to Los Angeles with his son, rediscovering why he fell in love with cooking in the first place. Favreau wrote it, directed it, starred in it. And unlike Iron Man, where he had thrown himself into learning CGI technology he had never touched before, this time he threw himself into something entirely different. He learned to cook, not movie cooking. Not standing in front of a stove looking convincing for 30 seconds before the director calls cut. He trained with real professional chefs. He spent time in real restaurant kitchens. He learned knife technique, heat control, timing, the physical language of someone who has spent years working a line. And it shows on screen in a way that is genuinely rare in food films. The cooking in Chef looks real because it is real. Favreau's hands move with actual confidence. The food looks extraordinary because actual skill went into making it. But here is what makes Chef so interesting in the context of his entire career, after Iron Man, after the MCU, after becoming one of the most powerful filmmakers in Hollywood. Favreau chose to go back to zero. He chose to be a beginner again. He chose a story about a man who had lost his way professionally and had to rediscover his passion by returning to the fundamentals of his craft, working with his hands, making something real, feeding actual people on actual streets in actual cities. It is impossible to watch Chef and not feel that Favreau was working something out for himself. The film is too specific, too personal, too quietly emotional about the relationship between craft and identity to be purely fictional. This was a man who had just spent years inside the biggest machine in Hollywood asking himself a question that the machine never stops long enough to answer. Why did I start doing this in the first place? Chef was his answer. And the answer, it turns out, was the same as it had always been. Not the technology, not the budget, not the franchise, the food, the people around the table, the thing you make with your hands that someone else gets to experience. That instinct, make something real, make something human, make something that has actual weight and texture and smell, is the thread that runs through everything Favreau has ever touched. Chef just made it impossible to ignore. Then came The Jungle Book, a live-action reimagining of the Disney animated classic, except that almost nothing in the film is actually live action. Every environment, every tree, every river, every shaft of light through the jungle canopy was built digitally. The only real thing in the movie is the boy. Neil Sethi, the 12-year-old actor who plays Mowgli, filmed every scene on a small practical set surrounded by reference markers, acting against nothing, reacting to creatures and environments that would be added later. The technical challenge of making that film look real was immense, and Favreau spent years on it, working with the visual effects team at Industrial Light and Magic to develop entirely new tools for rendering organic environments: bark, fur, water, light through leaves, with a level of photorealism that had never been achieved before. The Jungle Book won the Academy Award for visual effects. It was, by almost any technical measure, a landmark achievement. But for Favreau, it was something else. It was a proof of concept. If you could build a jungle digitally and make it indistinguishable from the real thing, what else could you build? The Lion King arrived in 2019, and it pushed everything further. For this film, Favreau and his team built the entire world of the African savanna inside a virtual reality environment, not as a collection of digital renders to be composited in post-production, as a navigable, explorable, photographable world that existed in real time inside a computer. He called it virtual production. The cinematographer could put on a VR headset and walk through the Pride Lands before a single shot was planned. The director could stand in a virtual field at virtual sunrise and say, I want to frame this from here, at this angle, with the sun at that position, and the team could see exactly what the shot would look like immediately. Then, when it was time to film, the camera movements were executed inside the virtual world, with the same limitations Favreau had always imposed on himself. No cranes unless a real wildlife documentary would use a crane, no impossible angles, no movement that a camera crew physically couldn't achieve in a real field. He was making a completely digital film, and he was shooting it as though it were completely real. The result was a movie that looked so much like a nature documentary that audiences genuinely debated whether actual lions had been used in production. They had not. Every frame was a painting. A digital painting of extraordinary, unprecedented beauty and detail. And it looked real because the man making it refused to let it look like anything else. But here is where the story takes its most interesting turn. Because everything Favreau had learned, from Elf, from Iron Man, from The Jungle Book, from The Lion King, came together in a project that most people in Hollywood thought was a strange career choice, a Star Wars television show. In 2019, Disney Plus launched with a new live-action series set in the Star Wars universe. It was called The Mandalorian. Favreau created it, wrote most of it, and produced all of it. And for The Mandalorian, he built something that had never existed before in television, something called the volume. Here is what the volume is and why it matters. Imagine a semicircular stage, about 75 feet across, 20 feet tall at the apex, the entire interior surface, the walls, the ceiling, covered in a continuous LED screen, not a green screen. An LED screen, displaying photorealistic environments in real time, rendered by a game engine that responds to camera movement, adjusting perspective and parallax as the camera moves so that the background always looks correctly three-dimensional. The actors stand inside this environment and they can see the world around them. The Mandalorian is not standing in front of a green wall being told to react to a desert he can't see. He is standing inside a desert, or what his eyes experience as a desert. The light from the LED screen falls on the actors naturally. It moves when clouds pass across a digital sun. It changes color at digital sunset. The practical and the digital are no longer separate elements that get composited together in post-production. They exist simultaneously in the same space at the same moment. This sounds like a technical refinement, a slightly better version of green screen, but the implications go much deeper than that. Here is the problem that the volume solved that nobody had properly named yet. When digital effects dominate a production, the experienced physical crew becomes progressively less useful. Think about what that means in practice. A cinematographer who has spent 30 years learning how light behaves, how a late afternoon sun rakes across a face, how firelight moves, how the ambient light of an overcast sky flattens shadows, that knowledge becomes partially irrelevant when the world around the actors is added later in post-production. When the light in the final shot is digital light, added by a compositor working at a computer 6 months after filming. The camera operator, the gaffer, the grip, the prop master, the people who built their entire professional lives around the craft of making physical things look beautiful on screen. In the age of heavy digital filmmaking, they are increasingly bystanders. The volume brought them back into the center of the process. Real cameras, real lenses, real lighting decisions made in the moment by real people responding to a real environment. The fact that the environment was displayed on an LED screen rather than existing physically was, in a meaningful sense, irrelevant. The craft was still craft. The decisions were still real. This is what Favreau understood and what he has articulated quietly in various interviews since then. The purpose of the technology is not to replace human skill. It is to create conditions in which human skill can operate. That philosophy runs through everything he has made. From the forced perspective of Elf, to the practical Iron Man suit, to the virtual production of The Lion King, to the volume of The Mandalorian. The technology changes, the philosophy doesn't. The Mandalorian became a phenomenon, not just a successful streaming show, a genuine cultural moment. People who had lost faith in the Star Wars universe came back for it. People who had never cared about Star Wars watched it. Baby Yoda, or Grogu technically, became one of the most beloved characters in the franchise's entire history within about 48 hours of the first episode airing. And the industry sat up and paid attention, not just to the show, to the technology. Every major studio began investigating the volume, how it worked, how much it cost, whether it could be adapted for their productions. Within a few years, LED volume stages had been built or were under construction at studios across the United States, the United Kingdom, and Europe. A technology that Jon Favreau had developed for a single Star Wars television show had become an industry standard, a new way of making moving images that will shape how films and television series are produced for decades. He did that. The guy from Swingers, the guy who used to wash dishes at a comedy club in Chicago. What makes Jon Favreau genuinely unusual in Hollywood is not his talent. Hollywood has talented people. It runs on talented people. What makes him unusual is his relationship to learning. Most people, when they reach a level of success, stop asking basic questions. The questions feel dangerous. They imply ignorance. They risk exposing gaps that a successful person is not supposed to have. Favreau never stopped asking basic questions. He learned improv from scratch, then he learned filmmaking from scratch, then he learned visual effects from scratch, then he learned cooking professionally when he needed to make a film about a chef, then he learned virtual reality technology and game engine rendering when he wanted to make something new. Each time, he started from a position of admitted ignorance. Each time, he absorbed everything around him and then applied it according to a set of principles that never changed. Keep it real. Keep it human. Trust the audience to feel the difference between something that has weight and something that doesn't. Iron Man launched a universe. Elf became a tradition. The Jungle Book redefined visual effects. The Lion King invented virtual production. The Mandalorian changed how television is made and gave the industry its next major technical paradigm. One filmmaker, one consistent philosophy, 5 different revolutions in 5 different areas of cinema and television, and the man behind all of it still talks about his work the same way he talked about Swingers in 1996, with curiosity, with genuine excitement about what comes next, with the improv instinct of someone who knows that the best thing you can do in any creative situation is listen, react, and build. You learn a little bit, then you learn a little bit more, and then one day you look up and realize you've changed the entire thing. That is Jon Favreau. And honestly, it's about time more people knew his name.